And I understand that your school district invested in training to help teachers to recognize their internal biases. I, I'm just wondering, I don't know if you've been a part of those trainings as well and just seen how people were reacting or what types of things were coming up for people. But for me, that was just a point of curiosity because, internal biases are just so internalized that a lot of times it's difficult for people to recognize them and really confront them in a way that's going to help them deal with these different populations of students in a better way. Welcome to Our Burning Questions, a professional learning podcast where we answer your most compelling questions about teaching, serving, and supporting multilingual learners. I'm your host, Jasmine Coaxum, and through our talks, I look forward to bringing the methods, philosophies, and stories behind teaching multilingual learners to light. Let's get into the show. Nate Franz is currently serving as the assistant superintendent at the Jamesville-DeWitt Central School District. Before his current position, he held a similar role in the Syracuse City School District. Nate started his career teaching elementary and middle school in Washington, D.C. He is also a proud graduate of the University of Wisconsin. Okay, so hello, Nate Franz, joining us today on the Our Burning Questions podcast. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. Nate, now the audience has already heard a little bit of your bio, so they're basically aware of your current position, etc. But well, usually I like to start with a little backstory of how I know the people that I'm interviewing. And in your case, you were actually suggested because you are in the district that is where the team is based that is running this podcast. So you were suggested to me by the team. And then as I dove into your work, I was really excited to talk to you today on this episode. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about your current role in education?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet you and to participate in your podcast. Super fun. Again, I'm currently serve as the assistant superintendent for curriculum, instruction, and equity in the Jamesville-DeWitt Central School District. I've been in this position, in this role for about 4 years, and the role was newly established when I came into it. So this is a new, huge capacity building position for our school district, and I was completely honored to select and be the first person to serve in this role.
Wow. And I mean, for a position to be newly created and for you to step into that's a little bit of pressure, I think, because you're like the inaugural person to fill, I guess well, at least in a sense, you're not having to fill anyone's shoes.
Yeah,
You are essentially providing the path, which can be, which can kind of
yeah,
have a little pressure there.
certainly
Um,
feel a little bit of pressure with that.
So, what I'm really curious about is what inspired you to be an educator? Because I understand that you started as a teacher in elementary and middle schools in Washington, D.C. I'm curious, were you teaching L's or ML's at that time? Or just tell me a little bit about how you got into the field of education to begin with.
Yeah, I started for my whole life. I had worked with young people. And so, whether it was teaching swimming lessons or I worked in a daycare through college, I worked at a group home for students either on their way in or out of the juvenile justice system. So, I had always been working with young people. And after leaving college, I was like a history and political science major. So, I didn't have a background in education, but knew that I wanted to work with young people. So, I started working at the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center, which was a preschool So I taught three-year-olds in a museum-based setting, which was fantastic and really
That's lovely.
exciting. And to be in Washington, D.C., working in the Smithsonian and going and when teaching kids about space and then walking over to the Air and Space Museum and sitting in front of a real spacesuit was so thrilling and exciting. But I really wanted to be in more of a public school setting in a formal sort of school. I'd loved school. I'd loved young people. My schooling experience was fantastic. And so I got a job teaching kindergarten. And for the first couple of years, I did not have any L's. I was working primarily in Northeast Washington, D.C., and the school population did not have any L's in the school. I was there for a few years and then ended up working in a school that did. And because there's a large Salvadorian population in Washington, D.C., some students from Ethiopia and Eritrea. And as I switched schools, the population changed. And so there was opportunities to teach L's, primarily Spanish speakers. And it was a really eye-opening experience in terms of just how to make accommodations, adjustments in my classroom. By that time, I was teaching math pretty exclusively. And so figuring out ways to connect, to make that learning relevant across any language barriers that may exist.
Okay. And I always find people's stories interesting, especially how they get into teaching or how they get into that, right? So let's just shift directly into your current position. So I'm just going to repeat it: Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum, Instruction, and Equity. I'm really curious as to the biggest challenges that you've had in this newly formulated position.
Yeah, I think it's really the piece that was very attractive to me was the fact that a high performing school district had decided to take on equity efforts head on. So really putting that equity in the title of a new assistant superintendent position was really compelling. And then the fact that they married in design curriculum, instruction, and equity together. And so that it was seen not just as a equity officer or a diversity officer, that it was central to curriculum and instruction as well. And so I think that is both the amazing thing that the district is doing and taking on. It also is incredibly challenging to keep that equity component and that lens centered as we work through elementary reading curriculum, as we talk about instructional strategies for all students, for L's specifically. So that's sort of the challenge. And a huge shout out to my predecessors who did this job in addition to all the educational services and the HR positions pieces that we now have another person for. So there's certainly enough work to do, and we've got a ton of progress to make. And so that's really just balancing and staying focused would be the biggest challenge at this point.
I like that you talked about equity being added on and being combined with curriculum instruction. I mean, to me, that's just a kind of natural symmetry. I mean, you can't really have any equity without considering curriculum and instruction and how that creates an atmosphere that is equitable in order for students to be able to learn. So I think that already that's a natural thing, but it's something that prior to kind of recent years, people hadn't really honed in on or just articulated the way that it's being articulated in your title. So I think that's really great. I am going to jump into now. I know that there was a strategic 5-year plan, right, from 2020 to 2025 that was actually put into place basically to ensure that all students in your district receive the tools that they needed to succeed academically. Now, I'm just going to read a little bit about the mission of this plan from the website. So basically, the Jamesville-DeWitt Central School District has an uncompromising commitment to excellence in preparing students to achieve and succeed, to respect themselves and others, and to practice lifelong learning in an ever-changing, richly diverse global society. We take responsibility responsibility for providing a challenging educational experience in a safe and nurturing environment. We dedicate ourselves to the academic, artistic, social, emotional, and physical development of each student. So I'm reading this mission because two of the statements in it really kind of lit a spark, I want to say, for me. And first is a challenging educational experience. This is really often at the core of a lot of conversations about teaching L's and ML's, as people usually tend to think that these learners can't really engage with complex subject matter and should be taught down to. There's that piece, which I appreciate that being in the mission. And then there's also to practice lifelong learning. I found that to be a little bit curious, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on the meaning of this as a part of this mission, this to practice lifelong learning.
Yeah, I think it's like really thinking about what are the skills, what is the knowledge, what are the dispositions for students to be able to be successful when they leave Jamesville-DeWitt. So regardless of what their next journey is and their path towards career, towards contributing to the larger society, that they continue to grow, develop, and learn and sort of be self-reflective in those spaces so that they can really make an impact on the community, whatever community that they eventually settle in after they leave at 12th grade commencement at Jamesville-DeWitt.
Okay, that's
my favorite. I wanted to add one thing. I'm
sure.
glad that those stuck out to you from the mission. My favorite part of the mission is we take responsibility, so that there's a collective responsibility, and that I think this is where it also gets to thinking about L's and other students who we have underserved historically and traditionally.
Right.
Would be that we as adults have to take responsibility, and we need to make sure we're being responsive to the students who are sitting in front of us and coming to our school each day, so that it's not problematizing students, it's not looking for excuses for particular groups of students, that it is the adult's responsibility. I think that's my favorite line in our mission.
Okay. And now that you've pointed that out, I think that's fantastic as well. I feel like definitely in your beliefs, in the beliefs section, I'll say, of this strategic plan. I mean, it seems as though you are definitely taking this very seriously in terms of the responsibility piece. I'm just going to read maybe 3 out of the 8 beliefs that I saw there and then just dive into a couple of those. So it says that we believe that students, family, school, and community all share the responsibility for education. So there again is that collective idea of responsibility. And it says we believe that a physically safe, socially and emotionally supportive, and educationally challenging environment that respects and values the diversity of our school community is essential to learning. Now, in fact, in an article that I was reading, I know that your superintendent of the district, Peter Smith, said that it begins with building connections and feeling safe in school. And that's not just a physical safety, but that's a social, emotional safety as well as academic safety. Are students willing to take risks, ask questions when they don't understand material, or do they fear being judged or looked at differently? This particular statement really resonated with me, especially when it comes to L's or ML's who are often judged for the difference in language ability. So I'm wondering if maybe you can give some specific examples of how these 3 elements of physical safety, social and emotional support, and academic challenge have been incorporated into the schools in your district.
Yeah, I think, well, one, it starts with just partnerships with families. So that's something that we've been working really hard at. We have a long way to go in terms of how we partner with families, from just initial communication, registration, and all these different processes in which we have our first initial touch points with families, and really taking a partnership stance in that. So that's something that we think about a lot, and we have a long way to go on. In terms of safety, I think we've been doing an enormous amount of work with the culturally responsive sustaining education framework that the state had put out several years ago. So we do training on all the different sort of major components of that framework. And the first one that's very good to know about is just the welcoming and affirming environment. So when students walk into school, that they are welcomed and affirmed for who they are, for whatever language that they're bringing is an asset to our community. It's an asset to them and to their family. And then also if there's cultural differences that we need to understand and know about, that they are recognized and understood by different staff members. So that's the approach that we're taking, is how do we welcome, how do we affirm students? How are they seen in the classroom, in the curriculum? How are they seen how is the language in our buildings more inclusive to students who come maybe with another language as their primary language? All of those are part of the professional learning that our district has been doing since the inception of that strategic plan. So that's sort of our North Star and our focus area for that, and how we have incorporated those very concrete strategic plan pieces in our trainings.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned a couple of things, because I wanted to highlight some other things that I discovered with regard to this engagement, right? This family and community engagement, which is one of the focus areas. I think there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 4 or 5, 4 primary focus areas. I know that back in 2022, on like a YouTube channel, there was a community forum, which was titled "Through the Pandemic and Beyond: Best Practices for Kids and Their Development." And in this community forum, you engaged the participants with a tool called Thought Exchange. I think it was like a very interesting way to get the thoughts of the community and to make sure that there was this engagement that you were just talking about. I'm wondering if there was an idea that was generated through this live thought exchange that you've carried out in your schools. For example, I know one of the ideas was for teachers to be trained to do 1 to 3 minute mindfulness activities that they can lead. I'm wondering if that was implemented, and if so, what has the outcome been? Or if that particular idea wasn't implemented, were there others from that kind of a live thought exchange that you were able to incorporate?
Yeah, so we actually conduct many of those thought exchange over the
Oh,
course.
do you? Okay.
Yeah, so we have a check-in from the beginning of the school year after 6 weeks. How are things going? Is there any changes that need to be made to the start of the school year? And all of those are very actionable, and so we're able to sort of step in and monitor and adjust as needed. So with every thought exchange, there's certainly something that we take and put into place immediately. I think from that particular one, it was really just understanding both like a menu of options for teachers to use. Our school psychologists and social workers put together sort of menus for classroom teachers to be able to implement, to check in, and to really be able to establish some of those classroom routines to help students be in a mental space where they can be learning in their classroom. I would also just add the other thing that really drives a lot of our work and adjustments is we do an annual climate survey now. And so we do climate surveys for students and for parents and for staff. And as an administrative team and as a community, we take a look at that data, and that's open for the public to look at as well. And made countless number of adjustments to our practices based on that climate survey results. A very tangible example would be at the high school, we saw that student belonging and feelings of belonging were lower than we wanted it to be. And so the high school administrative staff worked with a bunch of teacher leaders, and they provided some opportunities for students to open the lesson with a dialogue or a question. So the very start to the class was a little bit different than it typically had been. And the level of engagement went up significantly. And so we started to build those relationships around not just academics, but around how students are doing. And they were able to sort of just quickly pivot and implement something small that really had a great impact on the overall culture and climate of the building.
Wow. Okay. I'm glad that you mentioned a little bit about training as well. And I understand that your school district invested in training to help teachers to recognize their internal biases. And I was wondering if you could give me an example of what happens at one of these training sessions.
Sure. So we've had a couple pretty significant training opportunities for our staff. And the first one is, again, around that culturally responsive and sustaining education framework. So we've partnered with NYU to the Metro Center, and we have a 6 session, 30-hour training that our staff goes through. So we cover a multitude of various topics within that, but they address students all sorts of different ideas about L's, ML's, special education students of color across the board in terms of how who we're serving and why and what and who our work is impacting. So that's one pretty big chunk of training that we've done. Another training that we did was around bystanders and understanding bias, and then also being able to interrupt an incident if it was occurring. So how do you be a bystander and intervene if something is happening that shouldn't be happening? So that was another pretty significant piece of training that we've done.
I'm really wondering, I mean, how often people during those trainings are able to really recognize their internal biases. I'm just wondering, I don't know if you've been a part of those trainings as well and just seen how people were reacting or what types of things were coming up for people. But for me, that was just a point of curiosity because, internal biases are just so, I want to say, internalized that a lot of times it's difficult for people to recognize them and really confront them in a way that's going to help them deal with these different populations of students in a better way.
So far, I think everyone who's come out of our trainings, we do a survey afterwards, and the vast majority are taking away something, and it can be as extreme as understanding, oh my gosh, I've had this bias that I didn't understand, to something even more refined to say, oh, I think I was aware of this, but there's a new element that I need to consider. So
Mhm.
really, it's around self-reflection, and to the degree that every staff member comes out with a greater sense of self-reflection, I think is there in terms of understanding all of your unconscious biases. That we achieved that yet by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think we've increased the amount of self-reflection on our staff, and I think that they question our policies, our practices afterwards in a way that they would not have if we wouldn't have conducted the training.
Okay. And this next question, maybe you have answered it in a sense, but I still want to just touch on it because there's a powerful quote that you had in an article in the Daily Orange. This was last year. Okay. And you said, we are a majority white staff who have been exposed to majority white people for a long time. And this is going to shape what we think is normal and acceptable. So, I mean, my question was going to be, how has this fact impacted the status of equitable education at your schools? And how has your district shifted as a result of kind of just bringing this to light?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we talk about as an organization. It's something that we have to continue to talk about over the duration of our strategic plan. And it's really called into question some of the ways that our district operates. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
in reference to L's and ML's, for many years, our students, regardless of what attendance zone they were in, our L's went to one school because we were able to service them more efficiently. In
Mm-hmm.
terms of, so you might live next door to one elementary school, but you would get on a bus and go to a different elementary school because that's where our English as a new language program was housed. And I think if you weren't an English language learner, you didn't necessarily realize the impact of what that was, not being able to go to your neighborhood school. But through partnering with families, we understood that it was a longer bus ride. They missed more instruction. They weren't able to attend school with their neighborhood friends. And we saw that as something that wasn't appropriate, that was unfair to those English language learners who for many years did not say they wanted something different. And so what we ended up doing is we added some staff, and now every student gets to attend their neighborhood school regardless of whether or not they need English as a new language support. I think it took us a while to see that realization and to understand that, but what we were very excited to be able to provide that for families. And the transition was a challenge too. But that was an example of sort of not necessarily seeing a problem, and then once seeing it, being able to sort of put some action into place, both from a financial standpoint and an equity standpoint.
That's wonderful. And speaking of putting some action into place, I'm going to just name all four focus areas, but then I want to talk about just one of them. So the focus areas are culture of wellness, curriculum and programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then the one that we've already discussed, family and community engagement. So, in terms of culture of wellness, I understand that I found out from a News Channel 9 Syracuse newscast that I saw that on-site mental health clinics have been added initially at the middle school in 2022 and then at high schools as of last year in partnership with New York State. And I thought that was really fantastic. And I wanted to know if you could tell us about the impact that this has actually had in the schools in the district.
Yeah, it's been great, and this is a shout out to Onondaga County as well. So this is a partnership with Onondaga County
Oh,
in terms of better connecting our families, our students, to some of these different services. So that whole initiative is actually sort of falls into three different smaller buckets of work. So the first is on-site mental health clinics. So these are licensed mental health providers and supports through Helio Health, and they have an office in both our middle school and our high school. So students don't have to leave to go receive those services. And that has just been a fantastic partnership, and really thrilled to be able to do that in such an efficient way and provide that support for students. The second piece is an access liaison, and that is an individual who can help connect families and students to other resources that could exist in the community. Our counselors and our staff, they know a ton of different resources that could be out there, but in terms of programs that the county can provide, these access liaisons are the expert and can sort of pair up families to supports and services in the community. And then finally is a role that's called a promise zone specialist.
mm.
And this is a trained individual from the community who works full time for the county, but is placed in our schools. And they have a great deal of professional learning in terms of conflict resolution, management, and they're really there as an additional support with an eye on wellness in general that work in each of our schools. So they're in doing restorative conferences, they're supporting teachers and students in different ways. They're having lunch bunches and meeting with kids, ensuring that they have a trusted adult in the room, in the building. So they're a fantastic resource as well. So that culture wellness piece in partnership with the county falls into those three different roles, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have all three in our buildings.
Now I'm going to read a little kind of definition about equity because I think it really falls in line with everything that you've been discussing today in terms of the initiatives that the district has taken. And that is that equity is not giving all students the same experience. It is about giving each student what they need to meet their potential and have full access to the opportunities that make up a Jamesville-DeWitt education. I think that everything that you have been describing really fits into that, and that it's important and definitely worthwhile to note the fact that it is about focusing on how we can help different students, right? Like, not, okay, well, everybody just has the same experience. Great. Now we're equitable. I think for a long time, this is how people defined this equity piece. And so it's really refreshing to see this and to see how you have embraced this particular definition. Now, there's so much that has gone into this strategic plan, basically the strategic 5-year plan, which again started back in 2020 and is supposed to, I guess, be within 5 years. So basically, next year is, I guess, when some real, I don't know, maybe results are going to be expected, or maybe when there's going to be some analysis of what has happened within the 5 years. So, from your perspective, how would you say that this initiative has actually progressed? And do you think all of these goals will be met by next year?
Yeah, we are certainly a work in progress. And I don't know if you got a chance to page through, but there's an enormous amount of work that is within that strategic plan. And some things that said, oh, we're going to do this task. And year one task actually we've been working on it night and day for 4 years as we would move forward. So that there are many things are going to remain a work in progress as we continue to better understand and go deeper around different areas of professional learning as we try to increase our partnerships with families. We've made efforts in those, but we have yet to see, I think, our desired and intended impact on those. So one of the pieces in terms of just like the overall check on impact is we take a look at 10, 20, 30, and 40 weeks throughout the school year. We look at an impact report. So we take a look at key pieces of data in terms of school climate, in terms of attendance, in terms of academics, in terms of all sorts of different areas at different levels. And we look at the 10-week mark and we're able to compare sort of year to year at 10 weeks. Are we ahead of schedule? Are there some areas of concern? And so all of the efforts in that strategic plan are to create an experience for students that they want to be coming to school, they understand what's expected of them, and that they're learning and growing in those ways. So we want to take a dipstick throughout every school year to get a sense of, is that happening and to what degree it's happening? So we're really pleased with the trends that we're seeing in terms of outcomes, both short term and long term. But we also know that there's work left to do, that there are still students who, whether they're our special education students or our English language learners, that maybe are not coming to school as regularly as their peers. And so what can we do to connect with that around attendance? Or that maybe some students are overrepresented in terms of referrals or suspensions in our school district. And so what do we need to do about that? And how do we create a climate that isn't the case? We're pleased with the progress and the trends that we're seeing, but yet there's still a lot left to do. And we need another 5-year plan to keep chipping away at this and to keep moving forward.
Wow, another 5-year plan. Okay.
Sure.
But I definitely understand this idea, right? I mean, of it being a work in progress. I mean, we can't just say, I don't really know any initiative anywhere where you can say, okay, great, 5 years. Okay, after those 5 years, everything's like smooth sailing. It's completely exactly where we needed to be. There's always that sense of, okay, we have a chunk of progress and now we're going to move on to the next chunk. What is the next chunk of initiatives or things that we can do to further improve the situation, right? Now, I thought that those outcomes that you talked about they're very measurable, but very good ways to take the temperature of what's really going on. I missed one of them though. So it was attendance, academics, and what was the other?
Like school climate. So anything involving discipline or
Yes. Okay.
school culture, our climate survey, things of that nature.
Okay. All right.
And our social emotional learning as well for students. We have a social emotional screener that students participate in. So that would be the other sort of major data point that we're looking at.
Great. Okay. I mean, I've learned so much about everything that you are doing in the school district today. And I'm sure there might be some people wondering where they can find out some further information about these initiatives, about what's going on in the district, and maybe you yourself, maybe there's some particular talks that you're going to be having coming up, maybe some projects that you're also really heavily going to be focused on, maybe within the next year of this strategic plan. So, how can people keep up with what's going on?
Sure. So, I mean, I think our website does a fantastic job of staying up to date. There's great information in terms of news that's happening in and around the district. We have a wonderful communications person who really promotes all the amazing things that are happening throughout the district. So I think that's the first best place to start with that. I think also like our board meetings are open to the public. So our Board of Education does a really good job trying to keep our strategic plan and our students front and center. So anything that would be impacting those would be discussed by the Board of Education. And those meetings also, those dates and times can be found on the website. And then if folks are in the Jamesville-DeWitt community, I would really encourage them to stay on the lookout for when we would be starting our next strategic plan, because community input, community engagement around what are those priorities for the upcoming strategic plan looking out to past 2025 are there. And so if their parents or community members or students like to really get involved in that process so that they can help shape the best plan for our district.
Okay, so you heard it here. Check out that website. It will definitely be in our show notes for our listeners to check out. And so I'm going to ask you the final question that I ask all of the guests here on our Burning Questions podcast, which is, what burning question should today's educators consider in order to improve their service to the L and ML community?
I think it just starts. I think the question they need to be asking themselves is just how can I build a really strong partnership with the students and families, particularly of Ls and MLs. I think that's where it starts. And once that partnership is there, then anything can happen, and they can really reach that potential that we talked about with that mission and that vision. So really connecting, partnering, working together, building that relational trust so that you can really start getting into the rigor, the language development, and the content for all those students.
Beautiful. Beautifully said. Okay, so everybody, Nate, Franz, thank you so much for joining us today on the Our Burning Questions podcast.
It was my pleasure. I'm a podcast junkie, so this was a dream come true.
Thank you for tuning in to Our Burning Questions, produced by Midstate Auburn at OCM BOCES. If you would like to learn more about today's guest or any of the resources we discussed, please visit Midstate Auburn's webpage at ocmboces.org. That's ocmboces.org. Join us next time where we hope to answer more of your burning questions.